The German Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad in February 1943 not because Soviet tanks had superior armor, they didn't, or because Luftwaffe air support vanished, it operated until the final week, but because dysentery, typhus, and trench foot incapacitated more soldiers than bullets ever did. And the illnesses spread through an army that had received no soap shipments for 11 weeks, no fresh underwear for 9 weeks, and tobacco rations cut by 70% for 6 weeks. Friedrich Paulus commanded over 200,000 men when encirclement began in November 1942. By surrender, 91,000 remained alive enough to march into captivity, but fewer than 6,000 ever returned to Germany. Disease killed most of them. Soviet medical officers examining German prisoners noted that 78% showed symptoms of severe malnutrition. 62% suffered from frostbite in various stages, and 54% carried lice infestations dense enough to transmit epidemic typhus at rates approaching 100% within confined spaces. The Germans possessed sufficient ammunition to continue fighting. They had run out of the mundane supplies that kept human bodies functional in industrial-age siege warfare, revealing a calculus that military academies rarely taught. Armies disintegrate from failed hygiene faster than they collapse from firepower, and the most critical supply lines carry items that would fit inside a corner store. World War II consumed industrial output at scales that defied comprehension. The United States alone produced 300,000 aircrafts, 87,000 tanks, 352 destroyers and destroyer escorts, and 12 million rifles between 1941 and 1945. Those figures dominated strategic planning and captured public imagination. But the same industrial apparatus manufactured 600 million bars of soap for military issue, 5 billion cigarettes monthly at peak production, and chocolate rations totaling over 3 billion individual bars delivered to units worldwide. A single infantry division of 15,000 men required 40 tons of supplies daily just to maintain combat readiness, and ammunition represented less than 20% of that tonnage. Food, water purification tablets, soap, toilet paper, replacement clothing, and tobacco products comprised the bulk.
British planners learned these lessons expensively during the North Africa campaign. The Eighth Army's advance across Libya in early 1942 outran its supply lines by margins approaching 300 kilometers, stretching logistics capacity beyond sustainable limits. Fuel shortages stopped armor advances, forcing commanders to abandon 57 operational tanks near Benghazi, not because of German counterattack, but because no petrol arrived to move them. Food rations dropped to 1,400 calories daily, half the minimum required for men conducting mechanized warfare in temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Soap disappeared entirely for 6 weeks. The men's condition deteriorated with shocking speed, wrote Major General William Gott in his diary, March 1942, describing troops near Gazala. Skin infections spread through entire companies. Dysentery cases overwhelmed our medical capacity. We had ammunition aplenty, but couldn't maintain an effective fighting force because we couldn't keep soldiers healthy enough to operate their weapons. Desert combat created unique hygiene challenges. Fine sand abraded skin constantly, creating microscopic wounds that bacterial infections colonized within hours under filthy conditions. Soldiers developed boils that temporarily disabled them as effectively as shrapnel wounds. Water shortages forced troops to choose between drinking and washing, and men who drank contaminated water from inadequately purified sources contracted amoebic dysentery that could kill through dehydration within 4 days without proper treatment. The Eighth Army's combat effectiveness declined by estimated 40% during that supply crisis, despite suffering relatively modest battle casualties, a degradation that enabled Rommel's Afrika Korps to achieve tactical victories despite being outnumbered in armor and artillery. American logistics doctrine incorporated these lessons with systematic ruthlessness that transformed supply operations into a competitive advantage. The War Department established nutritional standards requiring 3,300 calories daily per soldier in combat zones, with strict quality controls ensuring food remained palatable enough to maintain morale. Quartermaster Corps procurement specifications ran to 14 pages just for chocolate bars, mandating precise cocoa content ratios, sugar concentrations, and melting points above 120 degrees Fahrenheit to prevent spoilage in tropical climates. The D-ration chocolate bar weighed 4 ounces, contained 600 calories, and tasted deliberately unpleasant to discourage soldiers from consuming them as candy, rather than emergency sustenance. Troops despised them. They ate them anyway during supply interruptions, and survival rates among isolated units correlated directly with D-ration availability. A study of infantry companies cut off during the Battle of the Bulge found that units carrying full D-ration allocations suffered 38% fewer deaths from exposure and malnutrition compared to units that had consumed or discarded their emergency rations before encirclement.
Cigarette rationing presented different challenges that military planners initially underestimated. Tobacco possessed no nutritional value and consumed cargo space that could carry ammunition or medical supplies. Yet field commanders universally reported that tobacco shortages damaged morale more severely than food reductions, creating psychological stress that degraded unit cohesion and combat performance in measurable ways. The Army allocated 7 cigarettes daily per soldier as standard ration, supplemented by personal purchases from post exchanges when available. This totaled over 5 billion cigarettes monthly across all theaters at peak deployment. Procurement officers sourced tobacco from American manufacturers under fixed-price contracts that guaranteed delivery regardless of civilian market disruptions. Cigarette production absorbed manufacturing capacity equivalent to building 15 Liberty ships monthly, yet no serious proposal to redirect that capacity ever gained traction because frontline reports consistently emphasized tobacco's role in managing combat stress. A smoke after contact steadies men faster than anything else available, noted Colonel Paul Freeman, commanding officer of the 23rd Infantry Regiment during Korean War operations that validated World War II assumptions. I've watched soldiers who were borderline panic calm down within 2 minutes of lighting up. Take away their cigarettes for 3 days and you'll see discipline problems that take weeks to correct. The pharmacological mechanisms underlying this effect, nicotine's impact on stress hormone regulation and dopamine release, remained poorly understood during World War II, but empirical observations sufficed to justify allocations that consumed tonnage exceeding many weapon systems. Soap production for military consumption reached 600 million bars between 1942 and 1945, supplemented by liquid soap concentrates totaling 40 million gallons. Each bar weighed 5 ounces and met specifications requiring effectiveness in salt water, cold water, and hard water conditions encountered across global theaters. Soldiers received 2 bars monthly as standard issue, more during intensive operations where contamination risks increased. The cost per bar approximated 3 cents, including manufacturing, packaging, and transportation, yielding total program expenditure around $18 million for the entire war. By comparison, the Manhattan Project consumed $2 billion to produce 3 atomic weapons, while soap production costs represented roughly 1% of that figure, yet contributed to combat effectiveness across every theater simultaneously. The comparison reveals how industrial wars' cost-benefit calculations defied intuitive assessment. Nuclear weapons ended the war with Japan through strategic shock, but soap kept millions of soldiers alive long enough to reach the battlefield where conventional weapons could function. Both proved essential.
Medical statistics validated hygiene supplies' tactical significance with brutal clarity. The American Expeditionary Forces in World War I suffered disease casualty rates approaching 55% of total casualties, with illnesses ranging from influenza to trench foot, removing soldiers from combat far more efficiently than German machine guns. World War II disease casualty rates dropped to approximately 15% through improved hygiene protocols, vaccination programs, and consistent supply of basic sanitation materials. A report from the Surgeon General's office in October 1944 attributed this improvement primarily to maintenance of adequate soap, clean water, and regular clothing exchange schedules that prevented the bacterial load accumulation seen in prior conflicts. The document quantified this impact. Every dollar spent on hygiene supplies prevented an estimated $3 in medical treatment costs and preserved combat manpower equivalent to recruiting, training, and transporting one replacement soldier at a cost approaching $8,000 per individual. Soap represented the closest thing to a free lunch that military logistics ever discovered, yet it generated none of the institutional enthusiasm that surrounded weapons procurement because it solved problems through prevention rather than destruction, making its contributions nearly invisible until their absence created catastrophe. The Pacific Theater tested these supply systems against environmental conditions that degraded equipment and personnel with remorseless efficiency. Temperatures exceeding 95 degrees Fahrenheit, combined with 90% humidity, created conditions where metal corroded, leather rotted, and human skin became a bacterial culture medium within days. Troops operating in New Guinea's jungles during 1943 faced fungal infections that covered 50% of their body surface if they couldn't maintain daily washing routines. The smell of an infantry platoon after 5 days in the jungle exceeded anything I'd experienced in civilian life, wrote Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Twining in his memoirs of Guadalcanal operations, August 1942. Men developed rashes that prevented them from wearing equipment. Tropical ulcers formed on their legs where leeches had bitten. Without soap and regular bathing, we would have lost combat capability before engaging the Japanese. Supply officers calculated that each infantry company required 600 bars of soap monthly in tropical deployments, triple the allocation for European theater units, and even that proved insufficient during prolonged operations away from established bases. Resupply aircraft flying into forward airstrips carried soap and cigarettes alongside ammunition as priority cargo, because experience demonstrated that soldiers without hygiene supplies abandoned defensive positions to seek clean water sources regardless of tactical considerations.
German logistics failures in Eastern Europe demonstrated how supply chain breakdown accelerated military collapse through cascading hygiene crises. The Wehrmacht's advance into Soviet territory during Operation Barbarossa stretched supply lines to breaking points by September 1941, forcing quartermasters to prioritize fuel and ammunition over everything else. Soap rations ceased entirely for frontline units by October. Clothing replacement stopped. Tobacco supplies became erratic. Soldiers wore the same underwear for weeks without washing, creating lice populations that reached crisis levels by December, when cold weather forced men into close quarters. Typhus spread through Army Group Center with devastating speed, infecting an estimated 200,000 soldiers during the winter of 1941 to 1942 and killing roughly 60,000. These casualties exceeded German losses from Soviet counteroffensives during the same period. "We defeated ourselves through administrative negligence," observed General Gotthard Heinrizi in post-war interrogation, reflecting on the Eastern Front's collapse. "The Red Army didn't destroy the Wehrmacht. We dissolved from the inside because we couldn't maintain the basic hygiene that keeps armies functional in prolonged campaigns." Soviet forces suffered even worse disease casualty rates, losing approximately 300,000 soldiers to typhus alone during the same winter. But Soviet strategic depth absorbed these losses through replacement pools that Germany couldn't match. The calculus proved grimly simple. Nations with sufficient industrial capacity to maintain hygiene supply chains could sustain armies in the field indefinitely. Nations that lost that capacity watched their military forces disintegrate regardless of tactical skill or operational brilliance. The contrast between ammunition consumption and hygiene supply consumption illuminated warfare's true requirements. The American Army fired over 6 billion rifle rounds during World War II, approximately 400 rounds per enemy soldier killed, suggesting enormous waste. But rifle ammunition weighed less than 1 pound per 20 rounds, making it logistically cheap to oversupply. A single 10-ton truck could deliver 400,000 rifle cartridges to frontline units, enough to sustain an entire regiment through a major engagement. That same truck carrying soap could deliver 40,000 bars, a 2-month supply for roughly 3 companies. The weight ratios favored ammunition, yet combat effectiveness depended more heavily on hygiene supplies because their absence created cascading failures that ammunition couldn't compensate for. Armies facing ammunition shortages rationed fire and adjusted tactics. Armies facing soap shortages collapsed into diseased mobs incapable of executing any tactics, regardless of ammunition availability. This asymmetry forced logistics officers to balance competing priorities through calculations that valued a bar of soap higher than 50 rifle rounds when measured by impact on sustained combat operations. What remains most instructive about World War II's supply logistics is not the impressive tonnages delivered or the industrial capacity mobilized, but how completely this dimension of warfare disappeared from popular memory, while tank battles and air campaigns dominated historical narratives. Soap and cigarettes altered battlefield equations more fundamentally than many weapon systems that received vastly greater resources and attention, yet generated no monuments, inspired no strategic theories, and became historical footnotes mentioned primarily in specialized logistics studies that few read. The pattern reveals something essential about how industrial societies conceptualized military power. We celebrate the instruments of destruction while ignoring the mundane systems that keep destruction's instruments functional. And we remember the spectacular violence while forgetting the ordinary maintenance that makes sustained violence possible.
In the end, the armies that understood this paradox, that combat power flows from soap as much as steel, won the wars, while armies that prioritized bullets over basics discovered that soldiers can't fight when they can't stand, can't concentrate when they're starving, and can't maintain discipline when preventable diseases kill more comrades than enemy action ever did.